Yes, could you? Thank you.
Okay. All right.
Thank you.
Oh, sorry.
Okay.
For my ins-
All right, everyone. Would you please be seated?
At NEH Gov. Tag us.
Good afternoon, and welcome to today's panel on planning inclusive futures. I'm Robert Newman. I am the president and director of the National Humanities Center, and it's my honor to be moderating today's discussion. We're gathered in the Teachers' Commons at the National Humanities Center in Durham County, North Carolina, on the ancestral lands of the Innu, Tuscarora, and Occaneechi peoples. We honor these lands and the people who once occupied them. We also are being joined here by a very large virtual audience, in addition to the in-person audience. The virtual audience is from all over the US and beyond, and I want to thank all of you in attendance for joining us. Today's events here at the center and this evening at the Hunt Library in Raleigh are the culmination of a multi-part conversation this spring, organized by the National Humanities Center and also our colleagues at the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. Our conversations, culminating in today's panel and this evening's lecture, have marked the 10-year anniversary of the Academy's landmark report, The Heart of the Matter, which outlines steps that should be taken to ensure the health and vitality of the humanities as part of sustaining a functioning democracy. I want to acknowledge the Academy's good work and the vibrant conversations that they hosted just last week on this topic. Tanya Muntz and Rob Townsend from the Academy have joined our in-person audience today. I also want to acknowledge the tremendous support of the National Endowment for the Humanities. The NEH has provided support and partnership to the National Humanities Center since our inception, and we're honored to have NEH Chair Shelly Lowe and her Chief of Staff Kelsey Coates with us today. Phoebe Stein, who directs the Federation for State Humanities Councils, has also joined us today. And I want to thank other friends who have made today's events possible, including Rob Dunn, Marian Fergola, and their colleagues at North Carolina State University, Toddy Steelman and Rachel Earnhardt from the Nicholas School of the Environment at Duke University, Tim Gable and our neighbors at RTI International, Sherry Paula Watkins and her team at the North Carolina Humanities Council, and Scott Leviton and our longtime friends at the Research Triangle Park. I also want to express appreciation to our friends at the GlaxoSmithKline Foundation and all of our institutional sponsors who support the Center's public engagement efforts, as well as our other work on behalf of humanities scholarship and teaching. We've invited today's panelists to help us revisit the ideas expressed in the Heart of the Matter report, and to talk about the humanities' importance not only to preserving democracy, but in helping us deal with the most challenging global issues that we're facing in the 21st century. I will note that today, April 4th, is an important day in history. Today marks the 55th anniversary of the assassination of Dr. Martin Luther King, a very tragic turning point in our history in America. And today also marks the first time that we've seen a former president indicted. In the interest of time, I'm going to offer only brief introductions for all of our three distinguished panelists, and then I'm going to ask each of them to share a few thoughts in response to a question to get us started, but I'm hoping that this conversation will sort of emerge and be rather organic, and we'll reserve about the last 15 minutes or so for questions from the in-person and virtual audience. First, it's my pleasure to welcome, to my right, acclaimed historian Nancy MacLean. Welcome her back to the center. Nancy currently serves as the William H. Chafe Professor of History and Public Policy and director of the Center for the Study of Class, Labor, and Social Sustainability at Duke University. Over the past few years, as political discourse has grown increasingly strident and white supremacist groups have found ready allies among elected officials in Washington, Nancy's writings on the ambitions and inner working of the American far right have been described as prophetic. She is the author of 5 books, including Behind the Mask of Chivalry, The Making of the Second Ku Klux Klan, Freedom is Not Enough, The Opening of the American Workplace, and most recently, Democracy in Chains, The Deep History of the Radical Right's Stealth Path for America, which was a finalist for the National Book Award and was, as described by Booklist, perhaps the best explanation to date of the roots of the political divide that threatens to irrevocably alter American government. Also joining us today is Shelly Lowe, Chair of the National Endowment for the Humanities. Shelly is a citizen of the Navajo Nation and grew up on the Navajo Reservation in Ganado, Arizona, and prior to assuming her role last February, she had served for 7 years as a member of the National Council on the Humanities. Shelly's career in higher education has included roles as Executive Director of the Harvard University Native American Program, Assistant Dean in the Yale College Dean's Office, and Director of the Native American Cultural Center at Yale. Prior to these positions, she spent 6 years as the Graduate Education Program Facilitator for the American Indian Studies Program at the University of Arizona. She has served in a variety of leadership roles nationally, most recently as a member of the University of Arizona Alumni Association Governing Board and of the Challenge Leadership Group for the MIT Solve Indigenous Communities Fellowship. She's also served on the board of the National Indian Education Association and as a trustee on the board for the National Museum of the American Indian. And finally, it's my pleasure to welcome one of the most respected figures in contemporary literature around the globe, Amitav Ghosh. Amitav's work of fiction and nonfiction have been translated into more than 30 languages and have been honored for their excellence with some of the world's most prestigious literary awards. His first novel, The Circle of Reason, was recognized by France's Prix Medici, the country's chief honor for a work in translation, and he's been twice shortlisted for the Man Booker Prize. In 2018, he was the first English language writer to receive the John Pitt Award, India's highest literary honor. Beyond his literary gifts, Amitav is well known for the depth of his insight and understanding of the ways historical trajectories shape current circumstances, such as the ways that Western science, technology, and culture have shaped non-Western parts of the world with potentially catastrophic results, a subject he explores in depth in his most recent book, The Nutmeg's Curse, Parables for a Planet in Crisis. In 2019, Foreign Policy magazine named him one of the most important global thinkers of the decade. So, welcome to Nancy, Shelly, and Amitav. So I want to start off with a question to each of our panels that I'd like each to answer, and our panelists should feel free to intervene at any point, jump in at any point, ask follow-up questions as they see fit, but I have plenty of questions for you. The heart of the matter identified 3 overarching goals. 1, to educate Americans in the knowledge, skills, and understanding they will need to thrive in a 21st century democracy. 2, to foster a society that is innovative, competitive, and strong. And 3, to equip the nation for leadership in an interconnected world. What, one might ask, has been the impact of such a high-minded report? In the decades since its publication, we've seen a precipitous decline in humanities majors and faculty positions. Democratic institutions increasingly have been imperiled. We're flirting with a global economic recession. Civil society is frayed into persistent polarization, and cultural diplomacy has been largely hijacked by nefarious social media outlets. A prevailing anti-humanities rhetoric has dominated political posturing and funding allocations for many who profess the need for a practical focus on economic viability in crusades against a manufactured woke ideology, and in demands for relevance that presumes STEM as the singular pathway to salvation. So my question is, what's the reset that is needed in order to reassert the original goals of the report? And I'll direct this first to Shelly, and then Nancy, and then Amitav, please.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Robert. Shelly Lowe Bilagana Nashla, Anastasia Tachini Bashashin. Bilagana Dashache, do Tramaha Dashanala, Locantiel de Nasha, do Washington de Shigan. My name is Shelly Lowe. I'm Navajo, originally from Ganado, Arizona, and I live and work in Washington, D.C. as chair of the National Endowment for the Humanities. And I think one of the things that I came into this position thinking about was a question that kept coming up when I was a council member on the National Council for the Humanities. It's going back to trying to assess who are we reaching in our work, but more importantly, assessing who we're not reaching in our work and who are we doing this work for. We all have really great ideas about what humanities does, what kind of impact humanities has, and the kind of work that we can do in the humanities, but I often have to question who are the populations, who are the communities that we are not involving in that work, and how do we start to open up avenues to get them involved and to encourage them to be part of what we do in the humanities, right? So assessing in particular the voices that we have left out of the conversation, assessing the knowledges that we haven't invited in to help inform us about this conversation and about how we do our humanities. What are the important aspects of the humanities that we really want to touch upon? But I also think, how do we bring in those voices that can really pinpoint for us the touch points with other disciplines where humanities really is playing a role, but we haven't brought and shined a light onto that role that humanities is playing in these other disciplines. And I think that that's been a real focus of the work that I've been trying to do at NEH, and trying to really assess what is it that we do, who are we doing it for, who are we missing, and how do we get them involved? And that would be kind of where I would start.
Thank you. First, I'd like to thank Robert Newman for his visionary leadership in convening this conversation, and more broadly for the work that he's done over some years now to connect the humanities and the National Humanities Center with the most serious challenges that we face in today's world. I applaud everything that Shelly just said, but I would say for my part, I believe the reset needed is to reclaim American democracy. It is a heavy lift, I know, but it is more urgent by the day, and almost everything we care about depends on its happening. What we're seeing in American life today is no longer liberal versus conservative, or even at its deepest level, though it assumes partisan framing, Republican versus Democrat. We're facing unimaginably well-funded radical libertarian strategists who see institutions at the core of our society as obstacles to their vision of radical transformation. This project is anchored in the fossil fuel sector, above all Koch Industries and the donor network built by Charles Koch, about which my colleague Amitav has some things to say, also allied with organizations promoting white Christian nationalism. And sadly, and I can explain how later perhaps, they have captured one of our two major parties since 2010. It's unrecognizable as the party my father once voted for. Ultra-rich donors from both camps, the corporate libertarian camp and the Christian nationalist camp, are funding, quite literally now, hundreds of organizations that are engaged in a kind of hostile takeover campaign aimed at Congress, state legislatures, public education, think Florida most recently and dramatically, election administration, higher education, and even investing in a group that is organizing within the military called Concerned Veterans for America. This audacious gambit depends on disinformation of the kind peddled by Fox hosts on a daily basis, pushing climate science denial, the myth of mass voter fraud, election denial, and more. How serious is the impact? To take just one measure, today's polls find that over half of Republicans in America now believe that higher education does more harm than good. We cannot achieve the goals of the heart of the matter in a situation this dire. So the first thing, I believe, is to realize that there are no easy fixes for the humanities that are not deeply engaged with what is going on in the rest of American public life. We must come to terms with the fact that we as a society are faced with self-interested, archly ideological actors who have been playing a very sophisticated long game for decades now. What looks to us like crisis and dysfunction in our public life is them getting closer to achieving their goal. What is that goal? A shackled democracy that cannot act on the will of the majority of the people on policy issues from climate change, their top concern, to, again, most other things we care about, from public education, Social Security, Medicare, I could go on. Therefore, I believe we must work in multiple arenas to turn things around while there is still time. The humanities as a domain and we as concerned citizens need to be part of a massive project of popular education that reaches beyond the usual audiences, that helps our fellow Americans to see what is happening and why, and that provides the knowledge and tools to protect cherished values and institutions and reinvigorate and renew democracy from the grassroots up. As Dr. King warned us in a famous work from 1968, he said our choice was chaos or community. For decades, by default, we chose chaos. I think what we need to do is try the other alternative and choose community. Thank you.
Amitav?
Yes. Well, let me say, first of all, what a pleasure and privilege it is to be here on this panel and to be here at the NHC, National Humanities Center. So I'm going to come at it from a different angle, which is what happens if there isn't a reset? What happens when STEM completely outweighs the humanities? Well, you know, I was teaching at Delhi University in the 1980s when right-wing movements of various kinds really began to shake up Indian political life. And one of the very striking things about what was happening in the universities then is that you would think that it was the engineering students or the science students who would be, as it were, on some kind of political left, opposing religious dogma and so on and so forth. But in fact, it was exactly the opposite. It was almost always the science and engineering students who took the lead in the leadership of authoritarian, right-wing, and most of all of a certain kind of religious nationalism. And that continued to be the case. And of course, in India, the big institutes of technology, which have contributed so much, or even to American tech, high tech, half the CEOs you see in Silicon Valley are from these IITs, as they're known. So the person who was the inspiration, who was rather the moving figure behind these institutes of technology was Jawaharlal Nehru, who believed very much in science as a kind of new religion, and dams are the new temples of our new society, and that sort of thing. But in fact, this was a completely misplaced faith, because in fact these science and engineering students are more prone to various kinds of right-wing tendencies than humanists are. In Delhi University, even as late as 5 or 6 years ago, the people who were holding the line, as it were, against right-wing authoritarianism, even within the universities, they were all students of history, students of English literature often. So this is a very striking thing that you see, and I think this is what we are actually seeing today even in the United States, that the outweighing of the humanities by STEM is actually pushing this on. And why does this happen? Well, one of the reasons that it happens is that the sciences are, by their very nature, extremely conservative in their institutional structure. They've always, in many ways, we like to think of science as being some sort of popular phenomenon that helps ordinary people, but that's never been the case. Science emerged out of colonialism. It was absolutely essential to processes of colonialism. And I think we are seeing something similar today. I don't know if you saw this news clip of the AGU, American Geophysical Union. Two scientists, Peter Kalmus being the better known of them, held up a banner. It was a very mild kind of protest. They held up this banner and said, we must act for climate change or whatever. They were immediately evicted from the theater. Their membership in the AGU was revoked. One of them actually lost their job. It's kind of really shocking. I don't think that in the AHR, for example, that would happen, So these institutions are, by their very nature, very, very conservative. So it is really striking to me also how much the humanities have yielded ground on, let's say, matters like climate change to the scientists and the technocrats and the economists. I think humanists, but especially historians, have very important things to say about climate change, because this entire framing of climate change that has completely taken root in America, which is climate change is about the future, it's about technology, it's about technological fixes. I think this is a completely misbegotten idea. And yet we have allowed it to take root instead of pointing out the deep historical roots of these phenomena. And it's simply because, historians tend to defer to scientists to a degree to which, that is really incomprehensible to me, I must say. So I think these phenomena all feed into each other,
Any follow?
I would say, I would add, I really like the idea that you talk about, Nancy. We have to really kind of think about community again. In January, and this doesn't solve how we think about scientists versus humanists, I was in Rhode Island, and they had just done the Rhode Island Civic Health Index for the first time in their state, and I helped, talk to organizational leaders in the humanities about what that report said and what the civic health of the state meant to the work that they do and how they want to think about moving forward. And the report wasn't the most positive report. And I said, I'm so impressed that you were willing to put this out, even though you've really pinpointed lots of negative things about the civic health in your state. And they said, well, of course, we want to really report what's happening. But it was really surprising to see how many individuals, and it's a small state, not like you can drive really far to have to go see a different community, right? But individuals were not talking to people who were not in their immediate neighborhood. They weren't talking to individuals who were of a different kind of community, however they defined their community. They weren't participating in public events. And it really came down to this idea of what does it mean to understand the civic health of your state or your community or where you're at? And then how do we really pinpoint those areas that we need to address in that index or in that health? Sure. Okay.
Okay.
Is that helpful?
We're good? Okay. Good. So, Shelly, I want to follow up on that because I think the American Tapestry project that you've initiated at NEH is a fascinating kind of reset of the kind I was asking about. So I want to quote from an interview you gave shortly after assuming your position as chair. And I love this quote. It's, as Americans, you say, we have to be able to plan and envision how we will live in an environment that is changing and probably a lot sooner than we were anticipating. We need to envision what a healthy living situation looks like. There are lots of stories from different cultural groups who have an understanding, hundreds of years of understanding of certain climate issues, like volcanoes, for example. Native Hawaiians don't see volcanoes as tragic. Volcanoes cause destructions, yes, but they also create new life and new islands. And having a better understanding helps us to really have a longer, more positive vision for the future. So I love that quote about the volcanoes and the different perspectives on it. And I wonder if you could talk more specifically about some aspect of the American Tapestry Project in terms of how NEH itself is changing and how related institutions must change to better embrace these multiple perspectives and the new stories that we need as we move forward into the future.
Thanks, Robert. That's a really great question. I think one of the first things that NEH is doing, and I really will credit the staff of the agency as I came into the position, and a lot of this groundwork had been laid already. There were kind of these pillars that the Biden-Harris administration had put forward that the agency really wanted to delve into and pay attention to. And part of that was diversity, equity, inclusion, belonging, accessibility within the federal agency. So it's been a couple of years now working on this, but we've been able to create some new positions within the agency that really do help us focus on that work and focus on building what we can within the agency to do a better job at reaching those communities that we haven't reached before, to make sure that we're including the voices and the stories that we haven't included in the work that we've done before, and making sure that we can be guided by that, right? And that it's one thing to do outreach and bring in these individuals and organizations that we haven't funded before. It's another thing to have an understanding of where they're coming from and have a clear understanding of what their challenges are. So we have just recently hired a strategic advisor for Native and Indigenous Affairs to really help us comb through our work with Native and Indigenous communities, because that is something that is so important to me. It's also leading into some work that we're doing with the Department of the Interior on the boarding school initiative and supporting them in helping to bring those stories forward and informing not just tribal communities and helping them to figure out how to deal with this history, but how to create education around that history that we haven't been teaching and a lot of individuals just didn't know about. As many of you may know, we hired a director of data and evaluation, something that we haven't had in many years, right? If we're going to figure out what we're doing and who we're reaching and who we're not reaching, we need somebody who's actually going to be in there doing that work and doing it in full time, really focused on it. This is something I'm really excited about. In higher education, we have offices of research. We can easily kind of go and ask for certain data. We can't do that at NEH at the moment. We can give you topical information and we can kind of pull some numbers, but we really need somebody to go in and look at the work that we're doing. What have we been achieving? Who have we been impacting, and what does that impact look like? And I'm really excited that this kind of work will inform an Office of Outreach that we're going to develop. And this Office of Outreach will really help us take the data and evaluation and the knowledge that we get from that office, the conversations that we will have through our special advisor and staff who are really working in other communities like HBCUs, tribal colleges, in our minority-serving institutions, but also small and rural communities and organizations, helping us to really devise and plan strategic outreach that we can bring them into the agency and make them a part of the work that we do. And lastly, we are creating an office, a chief diversity officer, and creating an office that will help us work within the staff and internally within the agency to make sure that we're all also informed that we have the knowledge that we need to move this work forward and to ask the right questions that sometimes we forget to ask of ourselves and how we do this work, and really trying to make sure that that helps us as we envision where our work can go and the impact that we can have with communities. And that has really helped build our American Tapestry Initiative, particularly in looking at democracy, but equity for all. And then what does it mean to think about climate, environment? What does it mean to think about technology as we move forward in this work?
Thank you. So just picking up on methodologies, and then I kind of want to get to Amitav and climate change because he's opened the door to that, and that's perhaps our most dire crisis of the day. But I want to ask Nancy, in Democracy in Chains, you tell the story of James Buchanan and how he helped to lead a push to undermine the public's trust in public institutions. The idea if I may summarize, was to get voters to direct their ire at these very public institutions and to divert their attention away from increasing income and wealth inequalities. So my question is a methodological one. How can the humanities, which are premised on critique and premised on interrogation, pushing of existing perspectives, how can they help preserve these institutions that are being undermined?
Thank you. I'm sure most of you have probably never heard of James McGill Buchanan, so just let me introduce him briefly. He was the first U.S. Southerner to be awarded the Nobel Prize in Economic Sciences, which he received in 1986 for work that he began in Virginia at the height of that state's leadership of the wider South in massive resistance to Brown versus Board of Education. I had never heard of James Buchanan when I came to the Humanities Center in 2008 for a fellowship in which I planned to explore how that era launched the modern push to privatize public education and examine in particular the role of the economist Milton Friedman, who leveraged this white supremacist response to Brown to promote tax-funded private schooling in keeping with his libertarian anti-government ideology. But early on that fall, I came across a footnote to a report produced by James Buchanan from the Center for Political Economy he had just founded at the University of Virginia in Charlottesville. And the wonderful ILL, Interlibrary Loan staff here, secured a copy for me from the archives. Without mentioning race, Buchanan pushed for the program of the most extreme segregationist, privatization of public education, in the language of economics. That got my interest, and with other clues led me to make him the focus of my research over a 60-year period that led me to discover that it was his ideas the Koch network and its allies were using in this hostile takeover of our institutions. Two key elements of that thought for our purposes. As Robert mentioned, a research program, most broadly called Public Choice Economics, more narrowly called the Virginia School of Political Economy, aimed to undermine trust in government and other public institutions, and he sold it to donors in the fossil fuel industry and other places under this rubric as a backdoor strategy to promote market solutions, that is, unleashed corporations, for all of our problems. Second, though, and really important, was his repeated advice to the many organizations on the political right with whom he worked. He said, if you're not happy with the outcome of public policies over a long period of time, and here you have to trust me that this libertarian network is essentially aiming at the 20th and 21st century of public policy. It sounds exaggerated, but read the book. He said, if you're not satisfied with those outcomes, stop focusing on who rules and start paying attention to the rules. And what he argued is that you have to change the rules to get the outcomes you want to see. Those ideas have since been applied to alter the incentives facing particularly Republican elected officials, but not only, with dark money contributions for the compliant and the threat of primary challenges for the non-compliant. Then those officials have passed measures from voter suppression and gerrymandering to attack on public education and teachers' unions. And we have seen, also funded by this donor network, the successful effort to capture the Supreme Court of the United States for the extreme right in our current 6-3 majority, which actually Senator Sheldon Whitehouse has written about in a powerful book called The Scheme of Rhode Island, I should say. So how can the humanities help us in this situation? I have to say for myself, and I've done a lot of traveling related to this work, more and more people in the humanities are recognizing the fused threats of accelerating climate catastrophe and rising authoritarianism. Shelley and the NEH American Tapestry Initiative aims to enlist the humanities, and I just love your mission statement, so let me quote it, to strengthen our democracy, advance equity for all, and address our changing climate. Also, faculty and staff in many educational and nonprofit institutions are developing courses and programs to address this. There are many organizations that are doing popular education for their members. Leaders in fields from social work to public health are realizing that the mainstream disciplines in our country have ceded civic education either to non-existence or to self-interested actors on the fringes of the far right. So I believe that we need to jump back in with both feet to apply the multiracial, gender-inclusive knowledge generated by various humanities fields over recent decades to renewing the bonds among citizens and our commitment to public goods like the arts, museums, education in its broadest sense, and quite frankly, taxes.
Okay. Any follow-up before I move on? Okay, all right. So let me ask, Amitav, let me get us to expand on climate change issues and the humanities by asking what I think is a kind of, or I hope is a kind of provocative question. In your 2016 book, The Great Derangement, you argue that the modern and contemporary novel has failed to address the global climate crisis, primarily because of its confinement to a Western epistemic tradition that compels writers to dwell on interiority of character, the psychological novel, the Bildungsroman, rather than on a collective calamity like climate change. Our inability to fathom the impact of an ecological cataclysm constitutes, in your words, a kind of psychopathology, which you label a derangement. And you write, the crisis that now grips the planet is a crisis that is all-pervasive and omnipresent, in which geopolitics, capitalism, climate change, and racial, ethnic, and religious divides interlock, each amplifying and accelerating the other. So I'm wondering, do you worry that the prevailing focus on identity politics that pervades and is the dominant discourse of humanities study, humanities pedagogy, humanities scholarship, distracts from our ability to fathom broader external perspectives? And how, if so, how do we reconcile these seemingly opposing vectors, or are they opposing?
That's a very good question. Yes, I do worry about that, and I do think that you're right that an increasing emphasis on, how shall we say, interiority in literature, but not just interiority. Now it's increasingly literature is about trauma. You know, contemporary writing, so much of it is really just trauma fiction, which is an extreme version, if you like, of a certain kind of interiorized fiction. And, you know, that's increasingly what's being taught in creative writing programs. It's being celebrated in creative writing programs. So the students who come out of it almost assume that they're going to have to deal with, you know, a certain epistemic tradition, as you put it. But, you know, I do think that there are some bright linings, you know. And I think one of those bright linings is really this whole new thing that has emerged, these environmental humanities concentrations. I mean, everywhere I go now, I see more and more universities, you know, founding these environmental humanities departments, which bring together people from many different kinds of disciplines, including the sciences, including economics often, including history, geography, etc. I think this is a very bright development. And it's not just in the United States, it's everywhere across the globe. Singapore has 3 major universities, and each of them has a major environmental humanities concentration. In Italy, there are so many now, you know, pioneered by Ca' Foscari in Venice. Stockholm has one. I think some Norwegian institutes also have them. And, you know, just a couple of weeks ago, I was at Iowa State University in Iowa, in Ames, Iowa, you know, and I was invited there by the creative writing department. And they have a really innovative pioneering program where they've sort of joined creative writing with environmental studies. So all the students who go in, and all these students are fully funded, especially at the graduate level. They study, you know, environmental sciences. They have to do field work, and they're writing stories and theses, you know, that come out of it. I think this. I believe it's actually unique, you know, and it's so interesting to contrast, you know, this program with the much more famous one of Iowa University, which, as we now know, emerged out of Cold War ideological struggles, where they were trying to create a sort of interiorized fiction as opposed to Soviet social realism. So, I do think there are these, a few things to be optimistic about.
May I just add a little point there? Hearing you talk about that, Amitav, which I hadn't known that the environmental humanities were so pervasive and transnational, but I think we could add to that medical humanities. And I don't think that there are programs quite as developed as what you've talked about, but we have had, the year I was a fellow here, we had a wonderful fellow from UNC who was working in the medical humanities, and there are also scholars working in the legal humanities. So I think many fields are seeing their need for the kinds of perspectives, knowledge, and toolkits that humanists can bring.
If I may just add to that, one of the really interesting things about these environmental humanities programs is that they're attracting much, much more interest than traditional humanities programs, A lot of kids are opting to go into environmental humanities, and one of the reasons why is because they have much better employment outcomes. Because of corporate social responsibility programs in various corporations, so they get snapped up, and I think that, again, is a very promising thing.
Well, as the person who started the first graduate program in environmental humanities in the country when I was dean at University of Utah, I'm also seeing in the projects that our fellows are bringing to the center, those fellows that are selected each year, more and more of an interdisciplinary perspective. And it's interesting to me that our universities and our colleges have been somewhat resistant to those kinds of interdisciplinary perspectives because they've fallen back on a somewhat archaic departmental structure. And, I wonder what your thoughts might be in terms of what changes need to take place. Do we need to collapse all departmental structures and resurrect them around issues of the day, crises of the day, which presumably would have people from different disciplines, different fields in conversation with one another to attempt to address those various crises? Any thoughts?
May I jump in?
Please.
Absolutely not. No, I think it's really important that we have interdisciplinary initiatives and that there are centers and institutes that promote that kind of collaboration. But also, I can say as a historian, there are whole fields of knowledge that don't have easy applicability to today. The medievalists got a boost with the pandemic because they could talk about the plague, but there are many, many important areas of knowledge that don't speak in a one-on-one relationship to now. I will say I think different disciplines are in different situations. My own discipline is history, and we faced a fierce attempt when I was at Northwestern from the then dean of the graduate school to kind of end departments and fuse us all, and I was one of a number of faculty pushing back on that. I think what goes on within the discipline of history is incredibly important as a way of learning and producing knowledge and learning the craft of research and interpretation and passing that on, and we would lose a great deal if we were to end that discipline as a discipline. Not that I have strong feelings about it.
I do think that in talking to younger students, both undergrad and graduate students, they're very interested, right? They're very interested in how do I take this one discipline that's, very structured, it's very kind of in this box, but add to it, right? That's the cool thing to do, right? I'm doing this plus this, and I've added this to my major. But when it comes down to it, part of it also is getting them to understand that there are ways to really think about the work that you're doing through a different lens and understanding that you sometimes have to step back and, we can talk about thinking and pausing, right? To say what knowledge is being privileged and what point of view does that knowledge come from? And then how do you really think about this is coming back to bringing in the knowledges that aren't being privileged in that conversation or discipline or yet, right? And then how do you try to add that or delve into that in your research to bring that to the surface and have it really grow a discipline or enhance what you're learning and how you can take that discipline and use it as a lens?
I agree with Nancy. I think it's very important to maintain certain kinds of, forms of training. My own PhD was in anthropology. And I think, you can't really, give anyone that perspective without a very sort of rigorous training in that subject. So I do think it's important to maintain those disciplinary boundaries often. But at the same time, that's why I like the idea of environmental humanities, because it brings people together from across the boundaries where they can, converse with each other.
So I want to shift gears a little bit and pose a kind of ontological question that kind of gets us to focus on, were we to publish a new Heart of the Matter report for the next decade, kind of what would it emphasize? What would it look like? And I want to ask all of you this question. So the Czech novelist Milan Kundera, who is probably most famous for writing The Unbearable Lightness of Being, has a novel called Slowness, in which he describes a secret bond between slowness and remembering, and conversely, between speed and forgetting. So he talks about if a man is walking down a street and he tries to recall something, without realizing it, he tends to slow down. Another man who is recalling an unpleasant episode begins to walk faster, as if trying to create distance from the memory, trying to outpace it. And I'm sure all of you, if upon reflection, have had similar experiences. So my question is it part of the mission of the humanities to kind of combat the rapidity of life and the speeds that may disrupt life or positive aspects of life? Is it the part of the mission of the humanities in the future to get us to slow down and reflect and listen and remember? Is it a kind of contrapuntal movement toward the rapidity of daily life and toward the exclusive focus on economically motivated values? Should a new Heart of the Matter report perhaps emphasize this ontological shift? And if not, what should it emphasize?
To be honest, I think one of the real problems here is exactly, the term humanities, which is just so anthropocentric. It just in itself shuts out so many kinds of other ontologies, other perspectives. And I think that's really something that we have to try and think about, how one can decenter this, the human that is always at the center of this. How can we, and that's one of the things I'm going to be talking about this evening. But I think it's just so important for us. You were talking about indigenous knowledge systems and so on. How do we begin to accommodate, like that wonderful book, Can Glaciers Speak? I love that book. It's just so interesting. Or, for example, the work on how forests think. All these kinds of non-human entities, how do we start bringing them into our knowledge system, It's so strange that, for example, forests, which especially since we know now that trees do communicate extensively with each other, they do have certain agentive properties whereby they create histories. Why is it that those things are so difficult to accommodate, within the traditional humanities?
Although for purposes of debate, I actually quite agree, Amitav, but I would say for purposes of debate, it was somebody working within a humanities tradition, Richard Powers, who wrote that brilliant book, The Overstory, that really tried to convey that to a broad audience, and I don't know if others have read it. I wished it had a somewhat more rigorous editor and been a bit shorter, but I felt it to be almost a spiritual experience to encounter what he was presenting in that book. But I think also to this, the other side of your question about slow thinking, I think it's incredibly important, and it isn't just humanities. We have people in the world of neuroscience saying that the book Thinking Fast and Slow, judging from the number of months and years it's been on the bestseller list, I'm guessing that a third to a half of the people in this room have probably read it, but it really shows that when we think slowly, we're engaging literally different parts of the brain that are more deliberative, careful, reflective, and we arrive at clearer judgments, whereas if we're thinking fast, we we can be engaging the kind of reptilian brain that some of our media actually aims at to incite tribal responses, and we don't make necessarily good decisions. We try to think about protecting our tribe, and that is not helpful to us. So I like that idea of thinking slow, and I will also say I had a wonderful lunch with some undergraduates the other day who were one was saying that when she grows up, she doesn't want her kids to have any kind of smartphones until they're 18 because they are so destructive of our capacity to think and focus and engage one another. But they shared with me an expression that I had never heard before, and I've been pushing out ever since. When people get too involved in this crazy online, fast-going world, there's an expression, touch grass. Maybe some of you know it, but I think it's a beautiful metaphor for what you're talking about that incorporates what Amitav is saying, that there are times when we need to just pull back, breathe deeply, and literally touch grass or get out in nature to kind of regenerate frozen conversations or ways of thinking.
Right. I think that we've had, for years, cultures have had ways of using the humanities to keep us strong and to keep us going and to keep us moving forward in ways and in times when we thought we didn't know how we could move forward. And I've always said that, humanities is hard work. You really do have to be kind of brave to go in and do the work in the humanities that's required. But when you do it and you can turn to humanities in difficult situations, I do think the humanities gives you the opportunity to pause. And that's something that you have to be willing to go into and do, right? And make sure that you are using the humanities. And sometimes it's just making sure that you recall what you've already been taught, right? The values and the ethics that you've been growing up with. And then you start to realize, oh, I already know how to deal with this because I was taught this before, or I read this book and it really helped me to think about how to move this forward. And I think that when we can do that, humanities then makes us stronger, and it gives us that opportunity to really move things forward. So I'm a big fan of humanities letting us pause and think first and then move forward.
I agree with you that Richard Powers' book is really an amazing and wonderful book. But it's very interesting to me that even though he's writing about trees and botany and so on, he frames them basically through science. And I saw a very interesting interview with him where he says, I wish I could apprehend these things as an animist would, but I'm not an animist. Contrast that with someone like Robin Wall Kimmerer, who for me is just such an interesting thinker. She's this great indigenous botanist. And, she's both trained in botany and she's, she has a whole indigenous tradition of relating to plant species of various kinds. And she threads the needle so beautifully between the two in her book, Braiding Sweetgrass. But she also tells this story. She teaches a course in ecology, and she tells the story about how she asked her students once, because these students learn all about the ecological devastation that's all around us. She asked them to name one positive interaction between humans and the environment, and they couldn't. They couldn't think of one. They couldn't think of one instance in which the environment is meaningful, interacts meaningfully with human beings. And that's exactly where we, with other perspectives, have to step in, to create this sense that there is meaning here. There is something other than just, chemical structures,
I'm struck, Jared Farmer's new book on ancient trees points out that the way that humans tend to look at trees is as individuals. We look at individual trees, whereas the proper way to look at trees is to look at the root systems, to look at them as communities, and how those root systems intersect and interact with one another. So a tree that is malnourished or unhealthy is being fed by the root systems of another tree. And it's in that community perspective, rather than in the anthropocentric individual perspective, that we see the true nature, particularly of these magnificent ancient trees. So in that vein, I want to quote from Jane Goodall, who celebrated her 88th birthday last week. And I've long been an admirer of Jane's, and she says it's all but impossible to describe the new awareness that comes when words are abandoned. Words are part of our rational selves, and to abandon them for a while is to give freer rein to our intuitive selves. So I think, and I'm going to address this first to Amitav. This may be anathema to him as a writer, but I think she's gesturing toward taking storytelling out of the box of human exceptionalism. What the eco-critic and literary critic Lawrence Buell has called extrospection. This is the kind of studied relinquishment of a self-centered perspective. It's guided by reaching out toward, but never perhaps enclosing the viewpoint of another species. But we're always reaching toward those other species, trying to establish empathy. So my question is if there was a singular key approach that we must make in order to achieve a fuller story of ourselves and our planet and our future, what would that key approach be?
Well, it's great that you mentioned Jane Goodall in that context because she's a hero of mine. And one of the reasons why she is because she is self-declaredly an animist. She says that when she was dealing with the chimpanzees and so on, that she could see this other intelligence responding to her in these very complex ways. And I think, we see that all the time in the animal world and in other worlds, but to me, the most interesting part of this now is exactly, the plant kingdom. Because I think the plant kingdom is actually the most intriguing and the most difficult thing to understand. And one of the reasons for that is that, I've been writing about the opium trade for a very long time. And I've just, I wrote about it in fiction for a very long time. But I've just finished writing a book on the 19th century opium trade. And it's more a sort of historical account. And I think when you write about the opium poppy, there's no escaping the thought that this is an intelligent being. It's intelligent, it's outsmarting us, it's defeated every human attempt to impose control upon it. It defeated the most powerful military in the world in Afghanistan. And it's going to get worse because this is a thinking creature. And we cannot begin to deal with it until we accept, something that Robin Wall Kimmerer again calls for. As she says that amongst Native Americans, there's an acceptance that plants are older than us, they were here longer than us, and in some sense, we are subservient to them.
Any other comments?
I think I would just add that, we have conversations about it's not just plants, right? It's water. And it's going to be things that we see weather related, right? There are things that we aren't going to be able to control. How do we then ensure that the work of the humanities is able to help us deal with it when we have to be in these situations to ensure that we can continue to maintain our cultural heritage, our collections, as we move forward, understanding that we won't always have the ability to control what might be coming to us in terms of the environment, in terms of the situations that we can find ourselves in. And I think it's really important to, like I said, pull back and use the humanities in those ways as well to ensure that we are at least prepared to deal with it as well as we could, even though we know we can't control it.
Nancy?
Those were very profound comments. I'm going to pass.
Okay. I'm going to ask a final question of all of you before I turn to questions from the audience. And that question is this. Much of the language that's being used around the humanities today is somewhat elegiac, kind of mourning the loss of a past, and it gestures towards forms of crisis within the academy and beyond the academy as well. But we shouldn't neglect the fact that there's incredible work happening in all of our fields too. So I wanted to ask each of you to talk a little bit about some of the collaborations, innovations, projects that have caught your attention recently and that make you feel hopeful and optimistic about the future.
Sure. I'll mention two. Both of them are from my field because it's what I know best. And I've also been deeply engaged in the field as it's faced challenges from political actors who are trying to intimidate, frankly, the teaching of honest history. So there's a national group that I urge you to check out. They have a wonderful website called Learn from History. This was it is something that's being supported by all the major historical associations in the country, as well as other community partners. I'll say just from its homepage, it says a broad bipartisan majority of Americans agree. For students to create a better society, schools need to provide a thorough, accurate, and fact-based history education and teach students to reject racism and respect the equal value of every person. And they do many things, but they have downloadable toolkits with guides for school system leaders, school board members, parents, students, and community members, and they are really trying to make that case that if we are going to try to achieve the things laid out in the Humanities report we're now marking the anniversary of, we must be able to talk honestly and openly about the best knowledge in our fields and help students get the tools and knowledge they need to navigate the 21st century world. I can tell you about another thing, too, that I've been involved in personally, a conference that will be held at Flagler University in September, and the title of the conference is The Freedom to Teach, Confronting Complex Themes in Contested Spaces. And it's an outgrowth of a conference that I and I guess about 100 or 150 other people attended at Yale University in the fall at the Gilder Lehrman Center for the Study of Slavery and Race and Abolition. But that conference was called Teaching About Race and Slavery in Challenging Times or something like that. Wonderful conference, teachers from around the country, but particularly from the Northeast, scholars, researchers, community members, and others. But as I was sitting toward the back of the auditorium in some of the sessions where teachers from the Midwest and the Northeast were talking about the wonderful things they're doing in the classroom related to race and slavery and other history in our country. I was sitting next to a wonderful Florida scholar and historian who was saying, wow, that's amazing, can't do it in Florida. Wow, that's incredible, it's against the law in Florida, and on and on. And so he and I started to talk, and the Gilder Lehrman Center at Yale, led by historian David Blight, got excited about this and have partnered with us, along with the National Council of History Educators, to have this conference in the fall where we will feature scholars, teachers, journalists, Florida students, and higher education administrators, and have resource tables from well over a dozen history organizations and public history defenders. Actually tomorrow we'll be talking with the former president of New College of Florida, who was unceremoniously, after a wonderful presidency, summarily fired. A man was hired making 4 times her salary with no competence. And another one of our speakers will be Derek Black. I don't know if people are familiar with Derek Black, but he was the subject of an incredible book, very readable, called Rising Out of Hatred. And it was about his life. I'm getting chills telling you this. He is the child of the founder of the Daily Stormer, a Nazi publication in the United States. His godfather is David Duke, the Ku Klux Klan leader. He was being groomed for leadership in the white supremacist movement. And he went to New College because they have great medieval history. And he was kind of in the closet about who he was, but it started to come out. And to make a long story short, it was challenging friendships, humanities, and critical engagement of people who provided him an off-ramp. He's now one of the most eloquent speakers against hatred, against white supremacy, and he's going to be leading a panel of student speakers at our conference, including many of the students who are at New College. So, I just mentioned that because it just grew out of almost nothing and is becoming bigger, but it's the kind of thing that all of us can be doing. If teachers and school boards are embattled in your community, this is, and by bullies, you can play jujitsu, right? And and let people see what's really happening, what the real value of this kind of learning is. And I think that will really bring communities and humanists back together in really exciting combinations.
Excellent. I think that I'm in a really privileged position because I get to travel and see all of these great projects and see these great institutions who have been funded either directly from NEH or through our 56 state and jurisdictional humanities councils. And it's been amazing to see the work that is happening out across the country and across the nation. And I think one of the things that really encourages me is when communities take the work and they make it important and meaningful directly to the members of their community. So one example that I haven't been able to see yet, but I would really like to see, we have a partnership with National History Day, and we use the 56 state and jurisdictional humanities councils to help really build National History Day, which is a competition for high school and young students on history projects that they can do. And they can do movies, short documentaries, they could do reports, they could do plays, they can kind of pick the genre of the project that they want to, or how they want to present it. But in Hawaii, our Hawaii Humanities Council has worked directly with the communities to encourage and to offer opportunities for the Native Hawaiian students to do their projects in the Native Hawaiian language only. So they will present them in the Native Hawaiian language to their community. And I really just want to go and see and hear that and see how they're strengthening not just the history lessons and the learning of students, but how they're really informing themselves and that work through their own humanities, their cultural understandings, and really moving that forward. I will be able to be in Georgia for National History Day, and I'm really excited to see what kind of projects come out of this when we really encourage students, in particular young people, to think creatively and to think about how to do something that really resonates with them and their culture and their understanding. And this gets, a lot more support through iCivics, that we have a cooperative agreement with iCivics that we have funded first with the Department of Education, but also through some funding that we gave to them again recently to develop civics education programs that are very specific to communities, and they can tailor these to meet the needs of their unique communities, and they could be small communities, but they're going to connect with institutions like museums and cultural centers to create this curriculum for K through 12 students and really use it in a way that meets their needs, but also makes it relevant. Because I think one of the things, and Amitav, you brought this up, is we don't define humanities in ways where people always understand what that is and what we're talking about. So if I went home to my home community and I said, what's civic engagement? What's the civic health of our community? I don't know how many people would be able to even answer that question and say, oh wait, what are you talking about? And we have to make sure that we have these areas and avenues and arenas that people understand clearly what it is that they're doing and how it is humanities, how it is civic engagement, how it is democracy, and what does that mean? And when communities do it themselves, that's what really makes me excited.
Your question was about optimism and what we can find to be optimistic about. Look, I must say that, and I think we all know this really, things are much, much worse than they appear, and they're only going to get worse. I think we all know this in our hearts. We know it with great apprehension. You can be sure that, these changed ways of writing history in Florida are going to have a profound effect upon people who are exposed to them. Decades ago, Pakistan rewrote its school textbooks, essentially writing every non-Islamic element out of it, and that really did shape minds. Now, just literally now, the present government in India has removed the Mughals and all Islamic references from Indian textbooks. And again, this is going to have a very powerful effect, let alone all the climate disasters, etc., that are coming towards us. So, when I look around me, I really find that something that my friend, the Italian philosopher Giorgio Agamben says, which is the only meaningful question now is che rimane, what remains? And I think some of the most, to me, if there's anything to be optimistic about, it is that this work of salvage, if you like, is proceeding in so many directions, including within philosophy, within history, the sort of work that you referred to occurring in the native Hawaiian languages, for example. Because really, I think those forms of understanding provided certain modes of resilience, which we need to know about, which we need to learn about.
Thank you. Thank you all for such thoughtful comments. I want to open things up to our audience. Matthew Booker, our Vice President for Scholarly Programs, has a microphone, and Jackie Kellish, our Director of Public Engagement, is monitoring the online questions. Where's Jackie? Okay, great. We have about 20 minutes left.
We have about 20 minutes, so I have a hand here, and I'll start here.
Okay.
I'll go over there.
My name is Ed Floyd. I worked 32 years at IBM. I was a problem solver. I was getting diabetes, they told me. I decided I'd find out what causes diabetes. Pretty soon I found out that 2/3 of people that had diabetes died of a stroke or a heart attack. So I decided to find out why people get sick. While my wife was at one of the malls shopping, I was out in the interior, and I ran across this little book by Scott Thrope, How to Think Like Einstein. Mm-hmm. And one of the things he said in his book is that if a problem seems like, it's beyond solution, a rule is probably at stake, and that is true. So our rule is, we decide to eat something that we're not supposed to eat. In nature, there's a duality of nature. You got two, like hot and cold, plus and minus, clockwise, counterclockwise, those type of things. That's what nature is ruled by. The flowers come up when the temperature gets a certain degree, and the sunlight. Two things to control all of that. Well, anyway, we are eating, we're herbivores. And for the cow, one time we gave the cow some animal meat, and it developed mad cow. Now, the reason we get sick is to keep us from going over to the other side. But we have found out how to go over to the other side. And those people tend to be Republicans. And they, like nature, the opposites are diametrically opposed. They can destroy one another. When it's cold and you take hot and cold, put it together, you don't have hot and you don't have cold anymore. You have something lukewarm. So the Republicans, they don't deal with facts. They deal with alternate facts. They think we are our enemy. They have all the guns. And unless we wake up, we're going to be out of here.
Any responses?
I think it was a statement that had some really, really interesting things to think about within it. So, yeah, I think we can go on to a question. Thank you.
Thank you, Matthew. Thank you. Thank you for the wonderful panel discussion. My name is QY Chu, and I'm glad that Amitav has mentioned, have noticed that in Singapore we do have programs in environmental humanities, because I teach in Nanyang Technological University, and I'm currently also a fellow at the National Humanities Center. So being in a technological university, my question is mainly, and also for this morning, I just read the news from Singapore that they are celebrating being one of the top smart cities in the world. And so my question is, having heard all the discussion about how humanities, we treasure slow thinking, and also I've also seen the tension between a lot of these Asian philosophy and spirituality, animism, etc., which is quite often what I teach incorporated in my courses in environmental humanities as well. But then these kind of non-Western and indigenous beliefs and Buddhist, Taoist thinking, etc., often are being seen as contradictory and have a lot of tensions with the scientific and the business discourses. And so my quick question is, how do we actually try and make the scientists, engineers, and the business world listen to us and take us more seriously, I guess? Thank you.
Well, I think, in fact, Singapore has been very active, very proactive in relation to that. You know, I visited Nanyang, your department, you know, the environmental humanities program at your university. And it's true, it's a completely technical university, but right at the heart of it is this environmental humanities program. And as I remember, when I was there, I was very struck by all the arts programs they had. So, you know, that's definitely one way to go, I think. But, you know, your colleague, Prasenjit Dwara, who has taught at Duke for a long time, he wrote a very important book on various kinds of environmental movements across Asia, and how all of them are basically founded upon various vitalist forms of thought, you know, Buddhism and so on. So I do think that these tendencies exist in Asia, you know. Certainly in Japan, the embrace of technology doesn't necessarily mean the rejection of, you know, traditional forms of thought. So, you know, I think there's something to build on over there.
I have two questions on this side, and then I think I'm going to the online folks, correct? Okay.
So I'm coming from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill in the History Department and Public Humanities program. I couldn't agree more about the role of the humanities in promoting democracy. But how would you help us? I'm going to be very specific here. We are facing governing boards, boards of trustees, alumni, who believe the humanities are fundamentally hostile to democracy, that we have become authoritarian, that we promote only one point of view. They are passing legislation of various kinds to ban any discussion of what they call compelled speech. There are even attempts in the legislature to, you know, correct the curriculum. And we've been given a new mandate to create a school of civics leadership or civic culture. How would you say that this argument, which is in the name of promoting freedom, stopping wokeism, how do we come back and say this isn't promoting democracy and freedom, it's hostile to democracy and freedom? Can you help us?
I don't know that I can help, Lloyd, but I can sympathize. This is happening on many campuses around the country. I have been watching the courage of your faculty in standing up for academic integrity and for shared governance in the university as this program is imposed against the will of the faculty, as so many of them have been. I think that we need to do a vast work of popular education among faculty and higher education administrators. On this question, there's a book that I would very much recommend that perhaps you've already come across by the political scientist Isaac Kamola and the corporate researcher Ralph Wilson that's called Free Speech and Coke Money, Manufacturing a Campus Crisis. And they actually show how there is interested donor money, and again, heavily but not only, fossil fuel, that is driving these campus imbroglios. They have funded the provocateurs like Milos Yiannopoulos, I hate to even say his name, he's never accomplished anything in his life, Charles Murray and others, in the full knowledge that bringing, you know, people who have published incendiary and often quite racist material, or, you know, promoting other kinds of bigotry, will anger students and invite the students into a trap of behaving badly and trying to silence that speech. Then they have also organized the trustees and alumni into something called the American Council of Trustees and Alumni. So the trustees and alumni on the university boards will then push for one of these centers on campus like the one you described. There are people who have attended the Association of Private Enterprise Education meetings where many of the scholars at these centers work, and also we know from Koch donor summits that the people involved in these projects boast to the donors that these centers on campuses are accomplishing three things that this movement has never had: a talent pipeline of bright young people to staff the operations that the network funds, as I described before, scholars, people who are employed in the academy who will generate ideas that can become policies for these efforts, and then defense for the operations. And I encountered that myself after Democracy in Chains was published, and I was attacked by, I knew I was kicking a hornet's nest, but I had no idea there were so many Koch-funded scholars and operatives before the book went to press. So I wholeheartedly sympathize with you. I don't have the winning strategy, but I will say the experience of other institutions is that the more that we can educate people and alert them to the interested actors behind these programs and what they are seeking, the stronger will be the position of faculty and community members who really stand for democracy. And again, just to take one measure of the danger of these Trojan horses, the Charles Koch Foundation is, at this point, the leading funder of climate science denial in the United States. By Greenpeace calculations, and this I think is only over a 10 or 15 year period, they've given over $130 million to climate science denying operations. So they're very eager to get that kind of thing into campuses, and that's what they've done at Duke. The Hayek lecture series that is done in partnership with the UNC enterprise has brought 2 leading climate science deniers to Duke. So I think we really have to talk to our administrations and say, what are you doing? You cannot run a credible science program in a university like this if you're doing this, or if you're bringing in people who are actively promoting the myth of voter fraud in order to get voter suppression. So it is really, really a challenge, though, and the best that we can do is learn from other people, connect with other actors who are facing this. Oh, and on that front, let me say every faculty member in this room should know about something called Faculty First Responders, which was created by one of the co-authors in this program. If you look it up, you'll see it, but they have resources for faculty who come under attack by Campus Reform, Turning Points USA, and these well-funded groups that are going after and targeting faculty and that boast of getting people fired. So it has resources for the faculty, but also for the higher education administrators, because most of them don't understand academic freedom, quite frankly, as the American Association of University Professors does, which has been defending it for a long time. So that website has resources that everyone should know and share for the people who come under these scurrilous attacks. But what was the last thing I was going to say? I think that's enough.
This is a very simplistic approach. If we want to address climate change, it seems to me that we have to learn to value each person individually and then move from that to see how the climate and all of the manifestations are affecting us. And I was wondering if the humanities, since there seems to be a decline in religion in general attendance, which tends to teach values, I wonder if the humanities would be a source of teaching values.
Yep, I do think so. And you said humanities is a source of teaching values?
Mm-hmm. And the value of each individual.
Right, and the value of each individual. I definitely agree, and I think that's one of the priorities out of the new initiatives that we're promoting under NEH right now, especially in American Tapestry, the equity for all, but also, part of really getting individuals to value everybody and other human beings in the world is to be able to give them the opportunity to tell their stories and to give that story to other people to hear or to listen to. or to be exposed to, right? And we need to do a better job of letting certain individuals and communities, particularly our rural communities or communities that we often don't think about and hear in the public very often, giving them the opportunity, the resources to be able to tell their stories and to be able, so that we can learn from them, to be able to share in ways that we haven't had those opportunities to do before. And I think that's one of the things that we're really hoping the new initiative through Any Age will allow communities to do.
Do we have questions from the online folks?
Hi, I'm delighted to learn from you this afternoon. I'm Phoebe Steinem with the Federation of State Humanities Councils. I've just been thinking, I do have a question, about this tension between the rest, the pause, the slowing down, and capitalism, and jobs that you mentioned very importantly, and just the urgency, right, that we hear today, not only about economic woes, but social, mass shootings, the climate. It feels like a moment of urgency, and I feel like historically that pausing has been associated with leisure, right, and with privilege, really. And if we're going to think about an inclusive future, how can the humanities kind of expand? I think about Tricia Hershey's work, Rest as Resistance, this book, A Manifesto. And I'm just thinking about how can the humanities help us bridge sort of this privilege of rest and I don't know, maybe combat the urgency or integrate the rest or the pause into the future. I was just thinking about what the role the humanities could play, and I was thinking about, yes, the poppies are so strong, but so is the market for what they produce, and that's a whole other issue. But anyway, just wondering about the role of the humanities in that inclusivity, in that inclusive future.
Well, you know, it's interesting that we are seeing this play out in real time, because after all, in France, there are demonstrations now because their rest is being taken away. They're being forced to give up all non-capitalist time, as it were. I don't know if you saw this a speech that Mélenchon, the left-wing leader, gave. It was a very powerful speech. It was exactly about time and about rest and what do you do about time and rest and so on. Again, I think this is one front on which we can't be very optimistic. Macron has succeeded in pushing, in ramming through these changes. What can I say? I think, globally we see this class becoming more and more predatory and stronger, and it's very hard to know how to resist. There's a question back there.
Probably time for one more question.
The folks online have been waiting quite a while, I'm afraid.
Okay.
I'm going
yes,
to give them the last word.
Online. Maybe we'll do two more questions.
Thanks so much, everyone. I just want to share one of the questions that was posed online in our YouTube chat. And Nancy, you've spoken to this quite eloquently in an academic context, but I wonder if any of you have seen efforts to form broader coalitions to promote not only academic but intellectual freedom, and if so, how any of you might recommend the public could get involved with some of those efforts.
Nancy?
Well, there are many organizations that work in this space. Certainly PEN, I don't even know what PEN stands for. It's been around so long, but the Writers organization, certainly groups like Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, and others, it is a global problem. And in places where right-wing authoritarianism has risen, dissent is being quashed, and people are losing the capacity to speak and to have their voices heard. But I think also, these efforts like Learn from History, there are many state-based things going on. I'm sure humanities councils at the state level are probably promoting programs that talk about the value of free thinking, of open education in classrooms. So all of that needs to be happening. I think other panelists might have ideas about this. It's really an important area.
Right. I would expand on the connecting with the State Humanities Council in your area, not just because they already have programming that's going on, but they have small grant lines for individuals who want to create and develop some opportunities for conversations like this that they can apply to, and they can kind of start to create these on their own. That would be definitely a resource I would look to.
Could I say one more thing in response to the wonderful question that you raised about this contrast between saying slow down and it's urgent, act? Frenzied actors don't make smart choices and don't behave well toward others. And so I think, we can I teach the history of social movements among, other courses. And, there are times when we see that in history, and certainly during the Vietnam War in this country, the war was becoming less popular at the same time as the anti-war movement was becoming less popular. There's a clash there, and I think, I don't mean to be simplistic about this. People were reacting to, horrific bloodshed, the daily body counts, all the other atrocities and violations of international law that were underway, but they were also stressed. And there's even, stories about SNCC when they were working in the Mississippi Delta and they were under such attack. People became stressed and defensive and nervous and didn't make good decisions. So, I'm not saying kumbaya, everybody rest, but there are ways that we can each take even 5 minutes, in a day and pull back and breathe, touch grass, as that metaphor goes. It doesn't have to be an elaborate vacation, but it can be a little bit of a vacation of the mind for people to recenter because, and that's something that's coming through very strongly in like the Black Lives Matter movement and many others, that there needs to be some attention to self-care in the movement to make sure that people are able to sustain themselves for the long haul and also continue to be able to communicate beyond their own ranks to others who don't agree with them. And generally shouting at people is not a way to get them to agree with you, but that's what stressed, exhausted people do. So,
I'd also steer you to the National Humanities Center's website, particularly its Humanities in Action website, which is a repository of resources and commentary dealing with crucial issues of the day. We could do one last.
Amitav might have
I'm sorry.
No, I was just saying that there's someone who's had a hand up for a long time. So,
in the back. Yes, Karima. We'll get you a mic, but please, quick, because we're out of time.
Great. I will be very quick. And the question from the online intersects with it, and that is, how do we reach, or do we need to be doing more collaboration with our educators? So for instance, NEH is very intentional with what you do with the K-12 Summer Institute programs. There's resources here through the National Humanities Center. So that's what I wanted you to speak to. What role, if at all, or are we missing a key player in not having a chair of a Department of Education, a dean of a Department of Education, those representatives in our state and federal departments of education in, again, these collaborative efforts, this community building efforts? That's my question.
I think that's a wonderful suggestion and a thought. One of my other thoughts is we have so many resources online for teachers. National Humanities Center has a resource online for teachers. NEH has Incitement online for curriculum development for teachers. Museums all over the country have these resources, but we don't have kind of one way to find all of them and to be able to say all of these are working together and there are these different facets that are on the same subject that I can really pull together. And what does it look like to bring in state educators to really think about the best way to have that be accessible and available and something that teachers can easily turn to, right? So that it takes the burden off of them in some ways, right? Because now they can find it much more easily, but also we have to also think about and listen to what are the curriculum needs that we're not addressing yet, right? If we look at all of the material that is available, what else is not being covered yet? Where are the gaps that we need to fill? And what does that look like? So I think your question is a very, very good suggestion, and we'll take that back.
Thank you very much. Thank you to our panelists for a very fertile, wide-ranging conversation. Please join me. I want to call your attention to the fact that Amitav Ghosh will be giving a talk tonight at the Hunt Library at North Carolina State University's campus, in which he will be expanding this conversation in his usual fascinating ways. And before we conclude, I want to thank again our colleagues at the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, at North Carolina State University, and also express our gratitude to the National Endowment for the Humanities and to all of those who have supported this important gathering. I hope to see most of you this evening at 7 o'clock at the Hunt Library on NC State's campus. Thank you again to all of you for your thoughtful participation in this afternoon's conversation and for your continuing support of the mission of the National Humanities Center. Thank you very much.